I'm tired of them, Mrs. Monica was saying. Their presence is bothersome. I have better plans for my kids, and I don't want them set back by children who clearly have unfortunate destinies. The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He stood there, frozen, as he realized she was on the phone with someone. Don't say such things, the woman on the other end replied. The children had no power to stop their mother from dying or their father from running away. Once upon a time, in a small community in Lagos, Nigeria, life was a mix of old traditions and new struggles. The community was always alive with the sounds of bustling markets, the vibrant colors of festivals, and the warmth of neighbors who often felt more like family. But underneath all the laughter and noise were the harsh realities of hunger, lack, and a future that seemed uncertain for many families. Edward lived in this community with his two younger sisters, Emily and Chichi. Their mother, Felicia, was a kind and hardworking woman who had always made sure her children were well cared for despite the many challenges they faced. She was a woman who never liked to depend on anyone, which made her a strong support to her husband, Andrew, and a pillar for her children. Felicia had formed a close bond with another woman in the neighborhood named Monica. They often helped each other out, running market errands together, looking after each other's kids, and sharing any business opportunities that came their way. Their families were so close that if you didn't know better, you might mistake them for one big family. The only difference was that Monica's husband, Mr. Madu, worked in a big company and was well paid, while Andrew was a struggling businessman whose business seemed to be going downhill every day. But no one could really tell how bad things were for Andrew's family because Felicia worked hard to fill the gaps. That is, until she fell ill suddenly and couldn't respond to treatment. When Edward's mother fell gravely ill, Monica and her husband stood by their side, offering support in every way they could. But despite their efforts, Felicia passed away, leaving her children in the care of their father Andrew and Monica. Andrew struggled to take care of the children after Felicia's death. He soon realized just how much his wife had been doing to keep the family running smoothly. He felt guilty for not appreciating her more and for not doing more to help her when she was alive. It was now that he truly understood how hard it was to manage everything on his own. Even with Monica's help, she would come by on weekends to help them make soups, stews, and other food preps for the week. She also did all their market runs for them. But 3 years after Felicia's death, Andrew became friends with a food seller at his place of business. After a few weeks, he decided he loved her too much to let her go. He wanted to live with her and her 4 children. When the woman agreed to his plans, Andrew abandoned his children and home entirely. His children couldn't believe their father had left them. They kept going to his shop and other places where he could possibly be, but he was nowhere to be found. His business had completely shut down, and he didn't tell anyone where he was going. But they kept hope alive, especially with Monica and Madu, making sure they lacked nothing. However, a few weeks later, Edward received a call from his father. Edward, his father's voice sounded distant over the phone. "I'm sorry, but I have relocated with my new family. We are in another country now." Edward felt the ground beneath him give way. "But why, Dad? Why did you leave us?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry," Andrew repeated, his voice full of regret. "I didn't mean to hurt you and your sisters, but I have to live my life too." Edward stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear long after his father had hung up. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. They had been abandoned. His father wasn't coming back. He felt too lost and confused to be angry at first. But when the anger did set in, it was fierce. He remembered his mother, the woman who had done everything to make sure they were happy and cared for. The memories of her helped him think clearly. Instead of acting out of his anger, Edward decided to make his mother proud. He wrote his father off his heart and turned his full attention to his sisters. "I won't let them suffer," Edward whispered to himself as he clenched his fist. "I will take care of them no matter what." Edward dropped out of school to ensure his sisters never had to. Just 15 years old at the time, he took on the role of both father and mother to Emily and Chichi. The burden was heavy, and the shock of their father's abandonment was still fresh. But Edward's love for his sisters was unwavering. He did every legitimate job he could find, from working as a bus boy to cleaning sewage. No job was too dirty or too hard as long as it paid the bills. He shut himself off from the world, developing a thick skin to mockery and shame. His entire life and focus became about his sisters. As long as they were happy and healthy, then all was right with the world. But things began to change when Mrs. Monica's help became less frequent. She started to distance her children, Ugo and Lily, from Edward and his sisters. Ugo and Lily, who were once close friends with Edward and his siblings, missed their companions deeply and often begged their mother to let them visit. This change in her attitude began when Edward made the decision to move into a one-bedroom apartment. He couldn't afford the rent for their three-bedroom apartment anymore, and he didn't want to overburden Mrs. Monica and her family, who had been of immense help to him and his sisters. When Edward went to tell them about his decision, Mr. Madu had offered to help with half of the rent, but Edward insisted on moving, so Mr. Madu offered to give him money for 2 years' rent on the one-bedroom apartment instead. "Edward, take, this is a gift," Mr. Madu said kindly, holding out the money. But Edward shook his head. "No, sir. I will accept it only if it's a loan. I will pay you back when I can." Mr. Madu hesitated but finally agreed. "All right, Edward, but remember, you can take your time paying it back." The landlord of their former house graciously refunded the remaining balance, even adding a little extra when he heard their story. Some of their neighbors gave them foodstuffs and other things as they were moving out. It was a day of tears and sorrow in their street, but Edward refused to see himself as a pity case. "This is just another beginning," he told his sisters as they moved to their new home. "We will be all right." The new community they moved to was not far, but it was quite different from where they had grown up. Mrs. Monica began to distance herself and her family even more, though she still helped them out with food and her children's old clothes once in a while. But it became worse when she found out what kind of job Edward did to put food on the table. Despite this, Chichi and Emily always begged to visit Lily on the weekends. Edward would use this visit as an opportunity to borrow Ugo's old books, which he read whenever he could. The children were oblivious to everything except that they could eat well-prepared food, played with their friends, and enjoyed their amazing toys. But Edward always sensed something was off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. One Saturday evening, after Edward had escorted Ugo to a nearby store, they returned to the Mado house. Edward went to inform Mrs. Monica that they were leaving, but as he approached the backyard, he heard her voice. "I'm tired of them," Mrs. Monica was saying, Their presence is burdensome. I have better plans for my kids, and I don't want them set back by children who clearly have unfortunate destinies." The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He stood there, frozen, as he realized she was on the phone with someone. "Don't say such things," the woman on the other end replied. "The children had no power to stop their mother from dying or their father from running away." "But that's why I said they have unfortunate destinies," Mrs. Monica exclaimed, her voice full of frustration. Edward felt tears welling up in his eyes. He didn't know whether to go forward or turn back. The pain in his heart was unbearable. Mrs. Monica, the woman he had held in such high regard, the woman he had considered a second mother, thought of them this way. Finally, he wiped the tears from his face and made a decision. He stepped forward and informed Mrs. Monica that they were leaving, trying his best to hide the pain and anger that were fighting for space in his heart. Mrs. Monica, flustered by Edward's sudden presence, noticed something was off about his approach, but she attributed it to her fear that he might have overheard her conversation a few seconds earlier. She followed him inside and handed him a bag she had packed for them. "No, thank you," Edward said politely but firmly. "We have enough food at home." Mrs. Monica tried to insist, but Edward graciously rejected it. Even the money Mr. Mado usually gave them, he refused. His sisters couldn't understand his attitude because they knew they needed that money and food to help them during the week. But they trusted their brother enough not to question his actions. They affirmed everything he said. Mr. Mado found Edward's behavior disturbing. He knew something had prompted this strange attitude, but he couldn't say what it was. For now, he decided to let the young man have his way. He would find out the real reason the next time they visited. Ugo and Lily escorted their friends as usual, sensing that something had changed in the air around Edward. But even if they couldn't get him to say what it was, only Lily knew, because she had seen Edward and overheard her mother's conversation. She felt such anger but didn't know what to do about it, so she pretended she didn't know. That weekend was the last time Edward crossed the doorstep of the Mado family until many years later. But this did not stop the friendship between the sisters, nor did it make Edward hate his friend Ugo. Instead, it gave him a hunger to change the narrative. Edward's determination was doubled, and he poured his life into making everyone who believed them unfortunate eat their words. The years passed in a blur of hard work and determination. Edward's routine stayed the same: wake up early, go to work, come home, and take care of his sisters. Every day was a new challenge, but seeing Emily thrive in university and Chichi excel in secondary school made every hardship worthwhile. Emily, now in her second year at the University of Lagos, was studying medicine. This had been her dream since she was a little girl. She loved helping people and wanted to be a doctor who could save lives. Every time Edward looked at her, he felt proud. "You are going to make a great doctor one day," he often told her. "Only because you are my hero, Edward," Emily would reply, smiling. She called him her hero because of all the sacrifices he had made for her and Chichi. But Edward always brushed off the compliment with a modest smile. He didn't see himself as a hero. He was just doing what needed to be done. Chichi, the youngest, had just finished her secondary school education with outstanding results. She was so talented in drawing that she wanted to become an architect. The walls of their small home were covered with her sketches and designs, each one more beautiful than the last. "One day, I will build us a big house, Edward," she would say, her eyes shining with excitement. "I know you will," Edward would reply, ruffling her hair. Their friend Ugo, who had always stayed close despite his mother's attempt to distance him, had graduated from university and was now studying for his master's degree. He often visited Edward, bringing him encouragement and support. "You are doing a great job with your sisters," Ugo would say. I don't know how you do it, but I'm proud of you. Lily, Ugo's younger sister, had also finished secondary school and was preparing for her university entrance exams. She and Chichi remained as close as ever, like sisters. They often studied together and talked about their dreams. Edward, despite his growing schedule, had somehow found the time to sit for his general certificate examinations. To everyone's amazement, he aced all his papers. It was a remarkable achievement, considering how little time he had to study. But Edward knew he couldn't afford to continue his education right now. The bills kept piling up, and his sisters needed him. He wasn't sad about it though. He knew that one day, when his sisters were settled in their careers, he could finally pursue his own dreams. For now, his focus remained unwavering. His life was dedicated to his sisters, and their happiness was his greatest reward. Even though things were not perfect, they were far better off than they used to be. Edward had learned how to produce paint and had started making his own brand. Though he didn't have a factory yet, his products were slowly gaining recognition. People liked his paint and kept recommending it to others. A few months ago, Edward had managed to buy a small flat from a man who was selling his properties to relocate with his family. The purchase had emptied Edward's bank account, but he didn't regret it. Now, he didn't have to worry about his sisters being without a roof over their heads. They didn't move in immediately, but when they did, Edward made sure the house had all the basic things young ladies needed. The joy in their eyes and their laughter had made it all worthwhile. One evening, after a particular exhausting day, Edward sat down with a cup of tea, savoring a rare moment of peace. The house was quiet. Emily was at a study group, and Chichi was out with Lily. Edward closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh, allowing the tranquility to wash over him. In this quiet moment, he found the strength to continue. As long as his sisters were happy and healthy, everything would be alright. But as he sat there, his mind drifted back to the difficult times they had endured. There had been moments when the weight of responsibility was so heavy that Edward didn't know how they would survive. There was a time when money was so tight that Edward could barely keep up with the bills. It was a particular harsh period, one that tested his resolve like never before. Emily was about to write her final exams, but her school and exam fees were still unpaid, and the deadline was fast approaching. Chichi's school fees was also overdue by 2 terms, and their landlord had given them a final warning: pay the rent within 2 weeks or face eviction. To make matters worse, there was no food in the house. The cupboards were empty, and Edward didn't have a single naira left. One night, overwhelmed by the crushing stress, Edward couldn't take it anymore. He ran out of the house, the cool night air hitting his face as he sprinted through the quiet street. The neighborhood, usually lively during the day, was now silent. Edward wandered aimlessly, not knowing where he was going. Eventually, he found himself in a small clearing. He sank to the ground, his head in his hands, trying to steady his breathing. The weight of his responsibilities was too much to bear. For the first time in a long while, Edward felt utterly helpless. His thoughts spiraled out of control. He questioned whether he could continue carrying this burden. He had always been strong, but now he felt as if he were on the brink of collapse. Tears that he had long held back began to flow, and he let them out. In that vulnerable moment, alone in the darkness, Edward allowed himself to feel the full weight of his struggles. Yet, even in his despair, a small voice within him whispered words of encouragement. The thought of Emily and Chichi drifted into his mind like a cool breeze, calming him down. He thought of their bright futures and the dreams they held there. His love for his sisters rekindled the fire of determination within him. Wiping away his tears, Edward made a silent vow to find a way through this. As he stood there, he heard a shuffling sound behind him. He turned around, startled. and saw two figures standing a little distance away, hidden in the shadows. Fear gripped his heart, but something told him to ask what they wanted. To his shock, he saw his sisters, Emily and Chichi, step out of the shadows. They looked more frightened than he was. Why? Why did you follow me? Edward asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. Chichi ran to him and hugged him tightly, crying. Edward, still in shock, gently unclasped her arms and bent down to look at their faces. Don't cry, please, he said softly. Let's go home. We can talk when we are safe inside. Holding their hands, Edward quickly led his sisters back home. The walk felt longer and scarier than usual, the dark, lonely road adding to their fear. When they finally reached their house and locked the door behind them, Edward let out a sigh of relief, but the anger and confusion were still there. Why did you follow me? He asked again, this time with more control. I thought you were both asleep. Chichi sniffled, and Emily glared at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. Why are you glaring at me like that, Emily? Edward asked, confused. I'm the one who is supposed to be angry right now. Explain to me why you are mad. Chichi looked at her brother and started crying again. She had never seen him so angry before, no matter how bad things got. Edward was always patient and loving, but tonight he seemed different. Her crying grew louder, and suddenly Edward snapped. Keep quiet, he shouted, slapping her across the face. The shock silenced Chichi immediately. Never in her life had Edward ever raised his voice at her, let alone his hand. But before she could react, Emily stepped in front of her, blocking her from Edward's view. If you want to leave too, just like Dad did, you can go without being violent, Emily said in a calm voice that hid the turmoil inside her. At least, Dad didn't hit us. I'm sorry we followed you and ruined your plans, but it wasn't Chichi's fault. I was the one who woke her up, but now you can go. We will survive, just like we did when Mom died and when Dad left. So if you are going to leave, do it now. She turned away from him, took Chichi's hand and led her into their worn mattress. Edward was stunned. He didn't understand what Emily was saying. Leave? What did she mean? He had only gone out to get some fresh air. How could she think he was abandoning them? Shaking his head to clear his thoughts, Edward walked over to where they lay with their backs turned to him. He gently laid his hand on Emily's back and felt her trembling. Panic set in as he realized she was crying uncontrollably. He quickly turned her towards him, ignoring her struggles, and hugged her tightly. Chichi got up and joined them, and Edward gathered her into his embrace as well. He couldn't hold back his emotions any longer and broke down in tears. It was the first time he had cried in front of his sisters, feeling so overwhelmed and unhinged. The moment they realized he was crying too, Emily and Chichi immediately began to console and apologize to him. They had never seen him in this state before, and it scared them. They thought they were the reason for his pain. When Edward finally pulled himself together, he gently laid them on either side of him and wrapped his arms around them, holding them close. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to say. The room was silent except for the soft sound of their breathing. I need you both to listen to me very carefully, Edward began, his voice calm but firm. I will never, under any circumstances, abandon you, not while I'm alive. You two are my world, the reason I get up every morning and keep going, no matter how hard things get. I'm not your father, and I will never do what he did. I promise you that. Emily and Chichi listened quietly, their fears slowly being replaced by a sense of security. Edward's words were like a balm to their wounded heart. Earlier tonight, I just needed some fresh air, Edward continued, looking from one sister to the other. It was late, and I was overwhelmed by everything. But I didn't realize I had wandered so far from home. I wasn't running away, okay? I was just trying to clear my head. Emily sniffled and nodded. I'm sorry, Edward. I shouldn't have thought that. I shouldn't have woken Chichi up and made her worry too. Edward shook his head gently. No, don't be sorry. I understand why you were scared, but you have to trust me. I'm not going anywhere. We are in this together, and I will always be here for you. Chichi wiped her tears with the back of her hand and looked up at her brother. You really promise you won't leave us? She asked, her voice small and trembling. I promise, Chichi, Edward said, his voice full of conviction. I promise with all my heart. They stayed like that for a while, just holding each other, letting the comfort of their shared bond wash over them. Finally, Edward pulled back slightly and looked at his sisters, smiling softly. You two mean everything to me, he said, and no matter what happens, we'll face it together. We have come this far and we'll keep moving forward. Emily nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. We'll make you proud, Edward, I promise. Chichi hugged him tightly again. We love you, Edward. I love you both too, Edward replied, his voice thick with emotion, more than anything in the world. After a few more moments of quiet, they finally pulled themselves together. Edward helped them get back into bed, making sure they were comfortable before he stood up. He watched them for a moment, feeling a deep sense of love and protectiveness wash over him. Get some rest, okay? He said softly. Tomorrow is a new day, and we'll face it together. Emily and Chichi nodded, their eyes already closing as exhaustion took over. Edward watched them drift off to sleep, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They were his everything, and he would do anything to keep them safe and happy. He quietly left the room and returned to the sitting room. The event of the night still heavy on his mind. He couldn't believe how close he had come to breaking down completely. But as he sat there, thinking about his sister's fears and the immense pressure he was under, he realized something important. He wasn't alone in this. His sisters were there with him, supporting him in their own way, even if they were too young to fully understand. Back from his thoughts, Edward leaned back on the sofa and closed his eyes, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The exhaustion of the day caught up with him, and before he knew it, he had drifted off to sleep. When Chichi and Lily returned from their outing, they found him asleep on the sofa, his head resting against the armrest, a look of peace on his face. Chichi's heart ached as he watched her brother sleep. She knew how much he had sacrificed for them, and she couldn't wait for the day when she and Emily could take some of the burden off his shoulders. She quietly set down the suya and yogurt she had bought for him on the table and went inside to get a blanket. As she returned, she was surprised to see Lily standing over Edward, watching him sleep with a soft expression on her face. Lily, Chichi called softly, causing Lily to jump in surprise. Oh, Chichi, I didn't hear you, Lily said, quickly stepping back. Chichi gave her a curious look, but didn't say anything. Instead, she dropped the blanket over Edward, tucking it around him gently. He worked so hard, Chichi said quietly. I just want him to rest. Lily nodded, her eyes still on Edward. He's an amazing person, she said softly. You are lucky to have him. Chichi smiled. We are, and we'll make sure he knows it. With that, Chichi and Lily quietly left the room, giving Edward the peace he deserved. The next morning, Edward woke up feeling more rested than he had in a long time. The blanket Chichi had placed over him had kept him warm through the night, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would continue to fight for his sisters no matter what challenges lay ahead. When he walked into the kitchen, he found Emily and Chichi already preparing breakfast. They looked up and smiled at him as he entered. Good morning, big brother, Chichi greeted, her voice full of warmth. Good morning, Eddie, Emily added, giving him a playful salute. Good morning, my two favorite ladies, Edward replied with a grin. What's on the menu today? Your favorite, Emily said with a wink. Akara and pap, just the way you like it. Edward's heart swelled with affection as he watched his sisters work together. He knew that they still had a long way to go, but with their love and support, he felt ready to face whatever came their way. As they sat down to eat, Edward looked at Emily and Chichi, his heart filled with pride. "You know, you two are my heroes too," he said, his voice sincere. Emily and Chichi exchanged a glance, their eyes shining with happiness. "We are a team," Emily said, raising her glass of water in a toast. "To us, and to all the dreams we are going to make come true." "To us," Chichi echoed, clinking her glass against Emily's. Edward raised his glass as well, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the family he had. "To us," he agreed, and they all took a sip, knowing that no matter what challenges they faced, they would always have each other, and that was all that mattered. 10 years had passed, and the lives of Edward and his sisters had transformed remarkably. The struggles of the past were now a distant memory, replaced by achievements and successes that filled them with pride. Emily, now a practicing surgeon, was making waves in the medical field. Her groundbreaking research and meticulous approach in the operating room had gained her respect among her peers. Senior colleagues eagerly took her under their wings, recognizing her exceptional talent and dedication. However, Emily remained humble, always aware that in the competitive world of medicine, one misstep could ruin a career. Recently, Emily had received an offer from the federal government teaching hospital, a grade 1 emergency center that promised extensive opportunities for growth. The pay wasn't as high as the offers from the private sector, but Edward had advised her to stay true to her initial motivation for becoming a surgeon, to help humanity to the best of her ability. "Money isn't a problem for our family anymore," Edward had reminded her, his voice steady and reassuring. "What's more important is that you are happy with the work you are doing, and that you are helping people like you always wanted." Convinced by his reasoning, Emily accepted the government offer. Despite some of her colleagues in the private sector calling her foolish for turning down higher salaries, she didn't mind. She was committed to her purpose. Chichi had grown into a talented architect, already building an impressive portfolio in a field known for its competitiveness. Her designs were innovative and inspired, reflecting her passion and creativity. She had made a name for herself, gaining respect and admiration for her peers and clients alike. Lily, the childhood friend who had grown up alongside Edward and his sisters, had found her calling as a nutritionist. After completing her studies, she became a nutrient specialist at a large food production company. Her career was flourishing, and she found great satisfaction in knowing that her work was helping people lead healthier lives. Meanwhile, Ugo, who had remained a steadfast friend despite the years and distances, had traveled abroad for further studies. He had recently returned, bringing exciting news of his upcoming wedding. The families and friends were busy with preparations, eagerly anticipating the celebration of Ugo's new chapter in life. Edward, now 35, looked back on the years with a sense of fulfillment. His sacrifices had paved the way for his sister's success, and he could finally enjoy the fruits of his labor. The factory he had started, which produced paint, was thriving, providing financial stability for the family. The weight he had carried for so long was no longer a burden, and he found joy in seeing his sisters thrive. Chichi had organized a reunion dinner for the 5 of them and insisted that everyone must be present, including Ugo's fiancé. "We need to get her used to our little community," Chichi had said with a mischievous grin. On the evening of the dinner, the air was filled with laughter and stories of the past. Chichi, in her usual clownish ways, entertained everyone with tales of her adventures as a female architect in a male-dominated world. Ugo's fiancé, who had initially been skeptical, was soon drawn into the warmth of their gathering. By the end of the dinner, she felt like she had known them all her life. Edward watched them with pride, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. The struggles of the past had shaped them into resilient, compassionate individuals who valued family and hard work. As they toasted to their bright futures, Edward knew that no matter what happened, they would be alright in that moment, surrounded by the people he loved most. Edward felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had been worth every sacrifice. The future was theirs to shape, and he looked forward to the adventures and achievements that awaited them. The wedding reception was a grand affair, filled with joy, laughter, and the warmth of family and friends. The hall was beautifully decorated, and the atmosphere was electric with celebration. Edward walked into the hall, his eyes scanning the room, filled with unfamiliar faces. Despite the grandeur of the event, he felt a sense of calm. It was a day of happiness, a day to celebrate love and new beginnings. Lily, however, had done her best to avoid Edward since the reunion. For the past 4 years, she had deliberately kept her distance, trying to suppress the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. But seeing him now, looking more handsome than ever, all those suppressed feelings came rushing back, overwhelming her. Her heart raced, and she felt the urge to leave the room to regain her composure. Just as she turned to go, Edward spotted her and started walking towards her, a warm smile on his face. Lily quickly shook her head, trying to dislodge the thoughts and emotions threatening to betray her. She had hoped that avoiding him for so long would help her move on from the feelings she had developed for him since she was a teenager. But seeing him now, looking so effortlessly handsome and real, made her realize that those feelings had only grown stronger. As Edward approached, he was frequently stopped by familiar faces wanting to chat, but he kept his eyes on Lily, determined to reach her. Finally, he was able to escape the crowd and saw her standing behind a pillar. He walked over to her. His eyes immediately filled with worry when he noticed how agitated she looked, even though she was obviously trying to hide. Lily extended her hand for a handshake, but Edward ignored it and pulled her into a hug. She stiffened, unable to trust herself to reciprocate. She forced a smile, standing still until he released her. Edward looked at her with a concern etched on his face. "Are you okay? You look like you are having a headache," he said, reaching out to feel her forehead. Panic surged through Lily, and she twirled away, stepping out of his reach, leaving Edward more confused and worried. He made to follow her, but Emily, who saw what happened, intercepted him, holding him back. "Let Chichi talk to her," Emily said to him. "Is something the matter?" Edward asked, his concern growing. He took a step forward, but Emily tightened her grip on his arm. "Leave it to Chichi," she insisted. Edward reluctantly agreed, his mind a haze of confusion. He kept his feelings to himself because at first, he didn't even understand what was wrong with him. 4 years ago, when Lily had visited after her induction ceremony, he suddenly saw her in a different light. She was no longer just his little sister's friend. He felt ashamed at first, recalling how he had known her since she was born, even though he was only 7 years old at the time. But the feelings had grown, and now he couldn't deny their intensity. Seeing her so troubled at Ugo's wedding gave him even more concern, even though he feared his feeling might not be reciprocated. Meanwhile, Chichi found Lily outside, leaning against a tree, tears streaming down her face. She approached her gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Lily, what's going on?" Chichi asked softly. Lily wiped her tears, trying to compose herself. I can't handle it anymore, Chichi. Seeing him again after all this time, it's too much." Chichi sighed, pulling Lily into a comforting hug. "I know it's hard, but you have to talk to him. You can't keep running away." "I don't know if I can," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "But wait, how do you know what and who I am talking about?" Lily asked suddenly, confused as she realized what Chichi just said. Chichi laughed and shook her head. "It is only the two of you who don't seem to know." "I don't understand," Lily said, still confused. "Well, I and Emily at least know how you feel about our brother. We just left you to handle it whichever way you felt comfortable." We didn't want to meddle. But that day you caught me looking at him, Lily began. But Chichi laughed again. I'm sorry, Lily. I know this is not a time to laugh, but I knew for sure that day. I had my suspicions previously, but that day I became sure. But you are not ready to talk about it, and I respected your decisions. I was scared you wouldn't approve, Lily said. I don't want to lose my best friend because I developed feelings for her big brother. That's why I couldn't tell you. Why wouldn't I approve? It's not like I'm his mother or something. Oh, Chichi, please. As if you don't know how protective you are of him. Lily interrupted, wiping her face carefully, feeling hope rise in her heart. Well, that's normal. He was, still is, the only parent we have. If we don't protect him, who will? Chichi replied. But on a more serious note, Lily, you are stronger than you think. And if there is anyone who can take care of my brother and love him as he deserves to be loved, it's you, Chichi reassured her. You have seen him at his worst. You know his journey and his struggles. And in spite of your mother's influence, your heart still beats for him. So, you have her blessings. If you can win his heart, why not? You might as well become our official sister. Let me see how your mother will continue to object after that. They both laughed, Lily breathing out shakily as her fears were erased by Chichi's words. And Edward deserves to know how you feel. You both do. At least, tell him and see where it goes from here, instead of dying silently. Chichi concluded mischievously, wiping the last traces of tears from Lily's eyes as she brought out her powder to repair Lily's makeup. They went back inside, Lily now laughing happily, her burden lifted halfway. She could finally enjoy Ugo's wedding to the fullest. As they returned to the reception, Edward stood by the door, his eyes filled with worry. When he saw Lily, his expression softened, and he took a tentative step forward. Lily, he began, his voice gentle. Lily looked at him, her heart pounding. Edward, can we talk for a minute? Sure, he replied, still worried, but making up his mind to open up to her about his feelings. The two of them stepped aside, finding a quiet corner where they could speak without interruption. Edward looked at her, his eyes searching hers. What's wrong? He asked gently. Did someone offend you? No, Lily said, shaking her head. I was just feeling overwhelmed. By what? Edward asked, coming closer to her, but Lily raised her hand and pushed him back a little. He was a little surprised and disappointed, but he respected her wish. Lily saw the disappointment look flash across his face, but she needed her space. She was going to say what she had kept in her heart for more than 10 years. I need to tell you something. And I need you to listen without interrupting, please. Okay, Edward said, and waited for her to gather her thoughts. He would tell her what he had in mind when she was done. After about a minute or so, and she still couldn't say anything, Edward, unable to stop himself as he gazed at her beautiful face, struggling to find the right words for whatever she was struggling to say, spoke up. I have missed you, he said softly. I didn't realize how much until now. Lily took a deep breath, looking up at him suddenly, all her emotions pouring out in that one look. But she needed to be sure, so it would not be a case of misinterpretation. With her heart pounding in her chest, she licked her suddenly dried lips and asked, What do you mean by you missed me? She waited, scared and hopeful at the same time. Edward took a step forward. When she didn't protest, he took her hand and said, Lily, Ifunanya Madu, I am in love with you. I have been for some time, but I waited because I needed you to become your own person, a woman with her own mind and voice. I didn't want to put a strain on your friendship with Gigi. A strangled sound escaped from Lily, but she quickly covered her mouth with a hand, her eyes widening. What she had been silently dying for years had been hers all along. Please, don't play with me right now, she managed to choke out. Do you mean what you just said? Edward nodded, understanding dawning on him. We have both been avoiding this for too long. I missed you too, but I didn't know how to handle these feelings. Lily began but couldn't go on as her throat closed up with emotions as they threatened to overwhelm her again. But this time, it was joy and wonder and love. As they stood there, the air between them heavy with unspoken words, they both knew that this conversation would change everything, and for the first time in years, they were ready to face it together. They spoke at length, each surprised at the other's depth of feelings. Edward's shock was more because he couldn't imagine her having that much love for him since her teens, and he was none the wiser. But he was glad they were at a mutual place now. From there, they would know how to navigate the mountains that stood before them. When they returned to the wedding hall, Lily, beaming with joy, made her way to her family's table, a bright smile on her face, feeling lighter than she had in years. But as soon as she sat down, she regretted it. Her mother, Monica, leaned in and pinched her, whispering, "What were you and Edward talking about outside that took more than 2 hours?" Her voice was a mix of irritation and curiosity. Lily rubbed the painful spot on her arm and replied quietly, "We are just catching up, Mom." "Catching up on what, eh?" Monica retorted, her eyes narrowing. "Was it not a few weeks ago that you people had that ridiculous reunion? Was that not enough catching up for you two?" "But Mommy, shut up, let me finish," her mother snapped, raising her hand to silence her. Lily bit her tongue, praying for her father to return from wherever he had gone. She could feel her frustration building but tried to keep her composure. Monica leaned closer, her voice low and stern. "Listen, in case you don't know, your father is already talking with Senator Humphrey because his son has declared an interest in you." "What?" Lily exclaimed loudly, drawing the attention of the nearby guest. Realizing she had drawn attention, she quickly lowered her voice but couldn't hide her shock and anger. Her mind raced with this unexpected revelation. She turned to face her mother, her pent-up anger boiling to the surface. But before she could say anything, her father approached, having rushed over from a conversation with some dignitaries. "What is going on here?" her father asked, looking between his wife and daughter with concern. Lily turned to her father, her face flushed with anger and disbelief, forgetting for a moment that they were in the middle of a wedding. "What did I just hear Mom say now?" she demanded, her voice sharp with hurt and frustration. "What did she say?" her father asked, his tone calming, but Lily was too agitated to listen. "What did I just hear about Senator Humphrey and his son?" she asked, her voice low but tense. Her father sighed, glancing warily at the people around them before leaning in to speak more privately. "Lily, calm down," he began softly, trying to soothe her, understanding where her anger was coming from. He decided to tread carefully. "We are going to talk to you about this later, but the senator's son showing interest doesn't mean you are married already, though we think it's a good match." "A good match?" Lily echoed, interrupting her father, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "What about what I want? Did anyone think to ask me how I feel about this?" Her father looked uncomfortable, shifting on his feet. "I know. That is why I said you are not married yet. We just thought." "You thought wrong," Lily interrupted, her voice low but firm. "I won't be part of some arrangement without my consent, and I certainly won't be battered away like some kind of prize." Monica's face hardened, her voice hissing with frustration. "You have to think about what is best for you, for all of us. This is a good opportunity." "For who, Mom? For you and Dad? Or for me?" Lily shot back, her eyes swelling up with tears of frustration. She felt cornered, caught between her own desires and her parents' expectations. She lived most of her life to please her mother, but on this one, she would not compromise. She had been able to remain friends with Chichi because she had fought unrelentingly until her mother gave up. And if she was going to make anything meaningful with Edward, she would have to fight even harder, seeing that her father was in on it too. The tension at the table was thick, and a few guests began to whisper among themselves sensing the discord. Just then, Chichi walked over, sensing the tension in the air. "Lily, I wanted to ask you something," Chichi said, trying to defuse the situation with a calm smile. She had noticed the tense conversation and thought she could distract Lily by asking her a random thing. But Lily, shaking with anger, stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Nothing," she muttered, pushing past Chichi. "Nothing at all." She stormed out of the hall, needing to clear her head, leaving her parents staring after her, stunned and unsure of what to do next. Edward's eyes had been following Lily ever since Chichi had gone over to her table. He noticed the tense exchange with her parent, the way Lily's face twisted with anger, and her abrupt departure from the hall. His worry deepened as he saw her parents' frustrated expressions. Something was clearly wrong. Without a second thought, Edward slipped away from the crowd and hurried after Lily. He caught up with her just as she was about to enter the ladies' room. "What's the matter?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern as he gently lifted her chin to meet his gaze. The moment Lily saw Edward's worried expression, all the emotions she had been holding back came back crashing to the surface. Tears began to pour from her eyes uncontrollably, as if a dam had burst inside her. She sobbed openly, not caring who might see or what they might think. Without a word, Edward wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as she cried into his chest. He rested his chin gently on the top of her head, whispering soothing words, trying to calm her down. He stroked her back gently, giving her the space to let it all out while providing the comfort she desperately needed. After what felt like an eternity, Lily's sobs began to subside. She slowly lifted her head from Edward's chest, her face streaked with tears. Edward took out a handkerchief and carefully dabbed at her cheek. His movement slow and tender, as if he were handling something fragile. He then turned to lead her to a chair nearby where they could sit and talk, but Lily hesitated, biting her lips and glancing away, embarrassed. "I need to repair my makeup," she said softly, avoiding his eyes. Edward chuckled softly, a small smile playing on his lips. "All right," he replied gently, understanding her need to compose herself. "But I will wait here until you come out." Lily nodded shyly, feeling embarrassed. And was that emotion behind the embarrassment? Happy? How can someone be embarrassed and happy at the same time? Lily pondered absently as she quickly ducked into the ladies' room. She splashed some water on her face, took a deep breath and tried to calm her racing heart. When she finally gathered enough courage to step out after repairing her makeup, she glanced around, her heart sinking momentarily when she didn't see Edward where he had promised to stand, and for some reason panic began to bubble up inside her. But then he noticed him a few steps away, talking with Ugo, who had left the dance floor to join him. Ugo spotted her first, his face lighting up with relief. "Ah, here she is," he exclaimed, his voice warm but tinged with worry. "What happened?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face. "I was looking for you to dance, but Mom said she didn't know where you ran off to." Lily managed a small smile, though her heart was still racing. "Is that why you left your bride and came out here?" she asked. Ugo laughed, though his concern was still evident. No, he replied, waving off her question. "She went to change her outfit." "But that's all the more reason why you shouldn't be out here." Lily continued to scold, feigning annoyance so she could distract him from asking her why she ran like their mother had reported. "We have guests inside. Come back in and let's enjoy the rest of the night," she said, managing to laugh light-heartedly. Lily hesitated for a moment as Ugo turned to go back inside, glancing at Edward, her eyes silently pleading for understanding. She didn't want to bring her personal troubles into Ugo's special day, and she could see that Edward understood. He gave her a reassuring nod, silently telling her that whatever was bothering her could be sorted out later. "Go on," Edward encouraged softly. "We'll talk later." Relieved, Lily nodded and took a deep breath, composing herself. Alright, she agreed. Let's go back in. I will come dance with you. Just be ready because I'm going to steal all the attention. As the siblings turned to head back into the hall, Ugo wrapped an arm around Lily's shoulders, squeezing her affectionately. They laughed together, the tension slowly easing away. Edward followed them inside, a small smile on his lips, feeling a sense of warmth as he watched them. He couldn't help but think about how lucky he was to have found himself in this strange but wonderful family dynamic. Despite all the challenges and the tension, there was a bond here, a connection that went beyond words. And as he walked behind them, Edward realized that whatever the future held, he was ready to face it, as long as he had people like Lily, Ugo, and his sisters by his side. Whatever made her cry like that, they would sort it out later. He didn't want them disrupting his friend's wedding. As the siblings went inside laughing, Edward walked behind them smiling, thinking how lucky he was. After the wedding, everyone had been too tired to do much except rest. Edward had driven Lily home after dropping off his sisters, but he didn't ask her about the incident earlier in the day because he felt there was enough time. He just wanted to bask in the euphoria of knowing that Lily was his now. Their relationship blossomed beautifully from there. Every day, Lily felt grateful that she had waited because if this was what she was in for, then she would have gladly waited another decade. She knew Edward was a good guy, seeing how much he loved and took care of his sisters, but she never imagined how romantic he would be as a lover. He was all she dreamed of, and then some. His sisters being the icing on the cake. They seamlessly transitioned from considering her as their friend to treating her almost like a new wife. Though they were still friends, there was a refreshing way they treated her now, almost as if they respected her. She couldn't explain exactly what it was, but she couldn't be happier than this, she always thought to herself. For 2 months after the wedding, Lily was packing up to move into her own apartment. Her mother, Monica, had given her an ultimatum: either accept the senator's son or someone of equal status as her husband or leave the house. There can never be two captains in a ship, Monica had declared, her voice broken no argument.